actually, before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that no matter where we live, it's important to appreciate the indigenous populations where each of us live. We pay our respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. We acknowledge their care for the land, waters, and skies throughout their history. We have a great deal to learn from the First Nations about care of country and the pursuit of global environmental sustainability. Something that's important for us to keep in mind. I want to point out that this lecture series is in honor of Walter Westman, and we're delighted to have his brother here, Robert. Fantastic. He was an International House resident in the late 1960s. He was an American ecologist, research, and activist who founded the National Organization of Gay and Lesbian Scientists and Technical Professionals in 1980. The lecture series was organized by International House staff originally, but when the House closed, organization was taken over by SUIHAA. And we have to give our thanks to Roger. I'm delighted he's here, Walter Westman, who's been involved with the House in so many ways over the many years. He's the one who initiated the lecture series, and it's delighted to have you. Thank you, Roger. Glad you could be here tonight. Actually, it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's, or this year's lecture, tonight's lecture. I say tonight because it's nighttime where I'm at. I'm in Seattle, Washington, United States, but it's daytime, I realize, in Australia. Delighted to have Warren Yates here. He's one of the founding directors of the not-for-profit social enterprise ClearSky Solar Investments Ltd. It was established in 2013. ClearSky provides an opportunity for community members to invest in solar installations on commercial and industrial buildings across Australia. And I know we're going to hear more about that as the day goes on. He's also the executive, he's an executive of the long-established Bega-based community climate action group, Clean Energy for Eternity. I love that title. He spent the bulk of his working years as an electrical engineering academic at the University of Technology, Sydney, where he currently holds the position of Emeritus Professor. Before I turn the mic over to Warren, we're going to turn off videos and mics so that all the attention can be in our presenter. At the end, we will certainly let people ask questions. We'll probably, since we have a reasonable number of people, we'll probably let people turn on their mics and videos at the end. But until that, if you have any questions that come to mind, please put them in the chat, or you can save them up for the end, whichever you'd like to do. Thank you for your cooperation with that. And before I turn it over to Warren, I want to also thank Roz Madden, who actually helped arrange for Warren to do this presentation. She's been working behind the scenes to help make this happen. And to James Kane, who was helpful in producing the flyer and is also working behind the scenes. So thank you for that. And thank you, Warren, for being here tonight. And let me turn the screen over to you.
Thank you, Dennis. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from unceded Camaragal land in Australia, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Let me share my screen. Okay. And well, I'd like to think that Walter Westman would approve of me giving this lecture in his honour. We have a lot in common. We even look the same at a similar age. Had he been alive today, I'm sure that Walter would have shared my dismay at the perilous state of our natural environment. The fate of coral on the Great Barrier Reef would have been a particular concern given his early career stint as a lecturer in ecology at the University of Queensland. Walter died in the 1990s, and it was a comparatively optimistic time for environmentalists. The Brundtland Commission report, Our Common Future, had been published in the late 80s, and it really looked as though this wake-up call was going to be taken seriously. It led to the Earth Summit in Rio in 1990, attended by large numbers of world leaders. And one of the outcomes was the signing of a pledge by 187 countries to address the carbon pollution problem. Following the summit, the UN International Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, was set up to provide sound scientific advice that policymakers would need. The IPCC was able to come up with estimates of how much hotter it would become as a function of greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere. To limit warming, there was a limit to how much more carbon we could put up there. It was called the carbon budget. The work of the IPCC has progressed through 6 sets of reports, which, with increasing refinement, and the predictions on temperature rise have been validated. Each year there is a conference of parties, or COP, to decide the global response to the IPCC findings. At the Paris COP in 2015, countries signed to a legally binding international treaty to, and I'm quoting here, hold the increase in global average temperature above pre-industrial levels to well below 2 degrees, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. If we want to have a 2/3 chance of staying below 1.5 degrees, the remaining carbon budget is 200 billion metric tonnes. The area of shading of these two graphs is the same. It's the blue area. It represents the carbon budget we had available in 1990 to stay below 1.5 degrees. The vertical axis is annual global emissions. Had we begun the task of reducing emissions in 1990, a 1% reduction per year would have sufficed, getting us to net zero by 2090. But that didn't happen. In fact, emissions have instead increased each year, apart from a small reduction in 2020 associated with COVID. To stay within the 1.5 degree carbon budget, annual global emissions now need to fall by 8% each year and halve by 2030. The lack of action in response to their warnings has led to despair among climate scientists, and that despair is very movingly captured in a book, Humanity's Moment, by Joelle Gerges, an ANU scientist and an IPCC contributor. It's highly recommended. But as Joelle argues, there is still a case for hope. Although global emissions keep rising, emissions in the EU fell by 7% last year, and there were lesser falls in the US, the UK, and Japan, but not in Australia. And the scenario of not much happening for a long time, and then suddenly rapid change kicks in, is what we might expect. It's taken a long time to develop clean energy technologies, to bring them down in cost, and to roll them out at scale. And there have also been huge advances in information technology and artificial intelligence that allow us to build reliable power systems despite the variability of renewable energy. The only barrier remaining is finding the $4.5 trillion to $6 trillion a year that the International Energy Agency, the IEA, estimates we will need to spend globally to make the transition. And just to put that into perspective, in 2023, global spending on defence was $2.4 trillion. I'm going to stop the share now for a moment. Good. I assume you can see me. I'm not an ecologist like Walter Westman. Indeed, I'm not even a scientist. But like Walter, I consider myself as an activist. As we've heard, Walter's activism was in gay and lesbian rights and AIDS awareness Mine is climate related. I can trace back the beginning of my involvement to the mid-1990s, when I was asked to develop and teach a core course to be taken by all UTS engineering students. For most of the 20th century, engineers considered their role to be conquering nature for human progress. They were not alone. For economists, nature was simply an infinite source of resources and an infinite sink for waste. But just as dissenting economists like Georgescu Ronan and Herman Daly were beginning to challenge their economist colleagues, within the engineering profession, there was also emerging calls for change. The course that I developed, along with colleagues, was part of the UTS response to a mid-1990s review of engineering education conducted by the Institute of Engineers, Australia. The course aimed to broaden the scope of engineering design to consider not just the needs of who was paying for the project, but all other stakeholders, including future generations. We studied some seminal texts, starting with the Club of Rome report. We introduced systems thinking and the notion of interconnectedness of all things. We challenged positivism and technological determinism, and we reviewed case studies of unintended consequences. I'm not quite sure how successful we were in teaching students, but it certainly changed my worldview. And in particular, I saw the need to eliminate the use of fossil fuels and pondered on what it would take to make the transition. I experimented on myself. I was able to significantly reduce my carbon footprint by using energy more efficiently and consciously avoiding activities associated with high emissions. I was an early adopter of solar, rooftop solar. But I knew that every dollar that I spent had an associated carbon emissions, and that despite my best efforts, as a citizen of one of the richest countries in the world, I was consuming far more than my global fair share of the remaining carbon budget. Not only that, but the fossil fuel burnt to date, a far bigger proportion than my global fair share had gone in supporting my lifestyle. My conclusion was that the rapid decarbonisation of the global energy system was needed, and that the wealthier the country, the more urgent the task and the greater the moral responsibility. But this conviction of mine was not shared by very many. In fact, the bulk of the population didn't share it, and for understandable reasons. Climate change is not an immediate threat like war, nor is it targeted on a single country like an earthquake. And as a result, it has not engendered the normal crisis response where communities bond together to deal with the situation with universal acceptance of whatever personal sacrifices that might entail. In the absence of a sense of immediate threat, it's perhaps not surprising that global attention shifted from what needed to happen to what impact any attempt to cut greenhouse gases would have on my livelihood or my way of life. Perhaps too little attention was paid to making sure that the burden of adaptation was equally shared or equitably shared. Instead of serious action to heed the scientists' warnings, we got fanciful transition pathways that would allow business to continue more or less as usual. And cheerleaders for this response were, of course, those with a stake in the fossil fuel industry. My own way of dealing with what I saw was a big disconnect between what was happening and what was needed was to seek out like-minded others. I came across Matthew Knott on the internet, and I'm going to share my screen again there. That's Matthew there. Matthew is a Bega orthopaedic surgeon. His climate awakening came on that exceptionally hot day in Eastern Australia on New Year's Day in 2005. He was on duty as a volunteer surf lifesaver on Tathra Beach, reading a book he had been given for Christmas, which was Tim Flannery's The Climate Makers. From that day on, raising awareness of the need for action became his passion. He inspired other locals to join him in establishing the community climate group Clean Energy for Eternity. One of their first actions was to organise a human sign on Tathra Beach. Amazingly, given the size of the local population, 2,000 turned up to make the sign. Clean Energy for Eternity then organised public meetings across southeast New South Wales, at which resolutions were passed urging councils to make commitments to transition to clean energy. They held fundraisers to equip community buildings with solar, starting with the Tathra Surf Lifesaving Club. I was impressed. With the support of my own local mayor, Denise Wilton, I invited Matthew and his team to run an awareness-raising public meeting in my home Sydney suburb of Mossman. Over 200 turned up, and for me, the most significant outcome was a suggestion from the mayor that what was needed was climate-aware individuals on council. So why didn't I stand at the next election? And I did, and I was elected. But I found that as a minority voice, I was not particularly effective. What I was able to get through in measures to prioritise active transport over driving met with angry opposition, and needless to say, I was not voted in for a second term. But the good thing about being on council was that I was able to meet like-minded individuals on neighbouring councils. Christina Kirsch was one of them. When she, like me, failed to get re-elected, we joined forces to form a local chapter of Clean Energy for Eternity. What better way to fill in our time now we no longer needed to be involved in council activities. Sitting around a table at our first meeting, we had an accountant, an architect, a solar installer, a psychologist, a science educator, and a couple of engineers. Brainstorming ideas about how we could most effectively leverage our volunteer time, we hit upon the idea of demonstrating what a good investment solar power would be, or could be. Rather than preaching at people, our psychologist told us, give them a positive solar experience. Messages from politicians advocating clean energy would then resonate. The virtuous circle would kick in. The more support climate action advocating politicians received, the more courageous they would become. At the table, our solar installer proposed that we set up a not-for-profit company that would make it easy for mum and dad investors to finance behind-the-meter installations on industrial and commercial buildings. In this way, the business could get an installation with no upfront costs. Instead, they would pay for every kilowatt hour of solar power generated at an agreed rate for a set number of years. He explained that this arrangement would benefit all parties as well as the environment. Over the term of the power purchase agreement, the investor had their capital returned with interest. The business paid less for their solar power than they would have had to pay from the grid power. And over a 7 to 10 year term, when it expired, the benefit was even greater, because the solar power was then free. At the table, our accountant told us that a way to minimise overheads was to make use of a provision under the Australian Corporations Act that under certain conditions exempted the requirement to have a financial services licence and other expensive compliance costs. Specifically, we were not allowed to advertise to the general public. Each project had to be financed via a fixed unit trust with less than 20 unit holders, and the capital raised by the trust had to be under $2 million. At our table, the engineers suggested that a further way of minimising overheads was to have all operations online, backed by a sophisticated IT admin system that, to the greatest extent possible, automated documentation and communication with investors. We applied for and received a $60,000 grant from the New South Wales Office of Environment and Heritage to implement our vision. In September 2003, ClearSky Solar Investments was launched. with a board of 4 unpaid directors recruited from our group. That's our website, www.clearskysolar.com.au, and I invite you to check it out after this lecture. Potential investors have to register on the website to get emails about projects as they come in. The email contains a link where they can download the project's information memorandum and an application form. The minimum investment has to be set at 1/20th of the amount that we need, given the number of investors we're allowed to have. One of our earliest projects was a cool room in a food distribution company in Mudgee in Western New South Wales. We needed to raise the funds to finance a 50 kilowatt system. That system size was chosen so that no solar power was ever exported. It was all used on site. Easy in this case, as even filling the roof with solar gave no exported surplus, even on weekends, as the facility operated 7 days a week. Because it was in a region where grid electricity prices were high, the 7-year PPA was both attractive to the end user and able to give investors a predicted 12.6% return based on the Bureau of Meteorology long-term average insolation data. To our surprise and delight, it took just a few hours before 7 investors had come up with the funds. That project reached the end of its term in 2021. Investors who had put in a total of $85,000 received a total of $147,251 in quarterly payments over the project term. As it turned out, there was more sunny days than Bureau of Meteorology predicted, and the actual internal rate of return was 15.9%. Since those early days, we have grown steadily. We haven't been able to match the returns of that first project. Now it's 6 to 8% is more typical. But our investors and our projects come from all over Australia. That's a picture of where the projects are. We have financed projects on 95 sites. In total, we've raised $25 million, and we have augmented Australia's renewable energy generation capacity by 12 megawatt. On the website, you can click on any one site and see more details of its performance and how much was raised and so on. Before moving on to the broader context, I'd like to share with you some reflections on a couple of crucial contributors to our success. The first is the collaboration we set up with our solar installer. Smart Commercial Solar is a family-owned Australian company with a significant commercial solar installations market share. Smart, for short, finds the projects, negotiates and signs the power purchase agreement, builds the system, owns the installation until the end of the term, monitors the end user, monitors the system output, and replaces faulty parts as needed. They also bill the end user monthly for the solar generation. ClearSky once a project has been commissioned, all ClearSky has to do is to build Smart for the generation and distribute the proceeds to investors. And then at tax return time, we need to issue investor tax summaries and complete and submit trust tax returns. ClearSky only works because of the trust relationship we have with Smart, and in particular, its MD, Ewan Hogerstager. We know that Ewan is as committed as we are to doing the right thing by investors. Together, we have worked out strategies to mitigate risks. That starts with rigorously evaluating the financial health and the likely lifespan of potential end users, and continuing by crafting the PPA to protect investors from adverse events such as damage to the installation or transfer of ownership. And to protect investors from market fluctuations of large-scale generation certificates, which are sort of government subsidy in Australia, which comprise a component of the return for projects above 100 kilowatts, Smart underwrites the LGC price. As an ethical investment, a ClearSky project is hard to beat. It is totally transparent in that investors can monitor the generation of their project online. This is an example of the performance data they can see. That top graph shows you the solar in orange and the consumption in purple. So you can see that all of the solar is being consumed on that particular day on that particular site. And those wiggles at the top of the purple, that's when the aircon switches on and off. If they live close enough, investors can see the installation and feel some sense of ownership. The only unmanaged risks are that the sunshine averaged over the term will be less than the long-term average, or the system will be down for an extended period due to equipment failure, a change of ownership, or a delay in commissioning the installation. Huon is on the left of this picture with two of my fellow ClearSky directors, Christina Kirsch and Neil Siebert, along with local politicians Zali Stegel, Michael Regan, and Rob Stokes. I think our fourth director, Kylie Hitchman, was taking the picture. This picture was taken on our 10th anniversary celebration, and it was held on one of our sites that we've solar powered, Four Pines Brewery in Brookvale. Apart from Huon, a second collaborator who's been crucial to our success is a retired British naval officer living in Canberra, Martin Sessions. Martin developed a very sophisticated IT-based administration system, pro bono. Martin has had first-hand experience of climate change through visits to the Benito Glacier in northern Patagonia, icefield, first in 1972, while he was with the Navy, and again in 2017 on a private trip by helicopter at his own expense. So here's a picture of Martin, both in 1972 on the glacier and in 2017. And here is one of Martin's pictures, before and after pictures of the glacier. The diminishment of the once mighty glacier had a huge emotional effect on Martin, and ClearSky was the beneficiary. Of course, the 18 megawatt that ClearSky has been able to add to Australia's renewable energy capacity is minuscule compared to what is required. In Eastern Australia, our current renewable energy capacity is 35 gigawatts. The Australian Energy Market Operator, or AEMO, claims that it needs to triple by 2035 and reach 213 gigawatts by 2050. This six-fold increase is due partly to the capacity needed because of the electrification of everything, that is, the replacement of petrol and diesel power to our transport system and the replacement of gas in our homes and industries. But another factor is the need for redundancy. In any particular location, the wind doesn't always blow, nor the sun shine. Lastly, our collective pursuit of comfort and convenience means that per capita demand for electricity seems set to rise year on year, despite our best efforts in energy efficiency. Since the Rio Summit in 1990, we've seen a rise in the internet, in blockchain mining and AI, all of which are highly energy intensive. Renewable energy capacity in Australia will need to climb even higher if the refining of metallic ores and the export of clean energy in the form of ammonia and hydrogen are factored in. As economist Ross Garner has pointed out, something will be needed to substitute for the wealth currently generated in Australia by our fossil fuel exports. Australian rooftops represent an underutilised resource. At present, only 1 in 3 dwellings have solar, and a high proportion of those don't fully exploit the roof. Even fewer commercial and industrial buildings are equipped. This image of the Brookvale industrial area in Sydney's north gives some idea of the underutilisation. There is a yellow circle for every property with solar. Its area is proportional to the kilowatt installed. This slide shows the aggregate area of solar-suitable rooftops in the Brookvale industrial area. is equivalent to 30 Brookvale ovals. That's the big square at the top of the picture. That rooftop area could support 30 megawatts of solar capacity. Multiply that by every industrial zone in Australia, and you have a substantial resource. So fully exploiting our rooftops is highly desirable and should be a national priority. Of course, utility-scale solar and wind farms will also be needed to meet the shortfall that remains. This is what AEMO predicts will be the split between rooftop solar and utility-scale solar as we progress towards 2050. The ratio of rooftop to utility solar could in fact be much higher if we fully exploited our rooftops. Now, it might be thought that economies of scale would make large-scale, standalone solar and wind farms a better option than rooftop solar. But this is not the case for a host of reasons. Utility-scale projects need land, and in the case of solar farm, an awful lot of it, as you can see from this slide. Gaining a social licence and planning approval for such projects can be a lengthy and costly process. Raising the large capital sums involved also takes time and involves many agents. Then the power from the solar farms has to be shipped to where it's needed. Thus, complementary investment is needed in transmission infrastructure. And transmission over long distances incurs energy losses. In contrast, the small scale of rooftop solar means the finance can be quickly raised, the installation quickly completed, no land has been alienated from other uses, some or all of the generation will be used on site. Of course, not all roofs have the structural integrity to carry panels, and clearly there's no point in putting panels on section of the roof shaded for significant periods of the day. But just like we shouldn't waste food, we shouldn't be wasting our roof resource. But it has to be done the right way. And to explain this, I need you to stay with me while I get into a little bit more complexity and detail. Every property with a fully exploited roof will lie somewhere on a continuum between two extremes. At one extreme, all the solar generation will be consumed on site. And at the other extreme, all of the solar generation will be exported because nothing is consumed on site. Tall office and apartment buildings fall into the first category. There's so much consumption on this site and so little roof area that there's no way the solar generation could do anything more than power a small fraction of the total consumption. On the other hand, this empty warehouse where there's no consumption on site with a massive roof, then almost all of the solar power would need to be exported. When the solar is consumed on site, as in this case, the investment payback time for the tenant or the owner is very short, a matter of a few years. And over the lifetime of the property, the return on investment is incredibly high, almost as much as mining minerals in Australia. When there is an equity issue, however, present tariff structures lump the cost of poles and wires and retailer costs in with the per kilowatt hour energy charge. So by reducing the amount of power you're taking from the grid, you end up paying less than your fair share of supporting the grid. You are, in fact, freeloading because your need for the grid is related to your peak demand, which you would still need to service on cloudy days. In some jurisdictions, such as California, solar owners are charged a levy to fund installations on low-income housing. This has the dual advantage of partly addressing the equity issue and also contributing to the full exploitation of the rooftop resource. When the rooftop solar system is producing more than needed on site, it is exported to the grid. A lot of other solar equipped properties will be doing the same thing because the sun is shining on their property as well. And since the short-term wholesale electricity price is determined by supply and demand, this flooding of the network with solar generation pushes down wholesale price. This might seem to be a good outcome, but it's actually hindering the rollout of utility-scale solar. The continuing flow of investment capital into such projects is dependent on an adequate return, which means a fair and predictable price for the energy they supply. On-site batteries that soak up excess daytime power are the solution. With an optimally sized battery, no power would be exported by day, with the stored energy used to power the premises overnight. Any remaining excess should be exported at a time when the grid needs it. These graphs show the notion of breathing in power in the peak daytime when the sun's shining, that's the yellow in that 2050 curve, and breathing it out again in the evening peak, that's the purple in that 2050 curve. And you'll see that by contrast to the present, we have quite a big change in demand during the course of the day. Not very much demand in the daytime when the sun's shining, and a lot of demand when the sun sets. And that causes big fluctuations in the price, and that's not good for anyone. Whereas with batteries, if they're appropriately used, then you flatten out the price during the entire day, and that's in everyone's interest. David Stewart is a property owner that we could all emulate. His company, Colourmaker Industries, manufactures specialised paints for both the Australian and international markets. David has filled his roof, the roof of his property, with solar panels. The 100 kilowatt system produces far more power than was needed on site. That excess was even bigger once he replaced a power-hungry air compressor with a more efficient model. So he went on to buy a battery that would absorb all the excess, doing the right thing by the grid and utility power generators. But given the plant mainly operated in daylight hours, what should he do with the energy stored in the battery? He needed to ensure the battery was fully discharged each morning to be ready to absorb the excess solar power during that day. The solution was to join a virtual power plant offered by a retailer. When you're on a VPP, under conditions you specify, the retailer can discharge your battery in order to supply power to the grid when it is needed in the evening peak. Power exported when the supply is short is much more valuable, both for the exporter and the grid, than power exported at times of abundance. It occurred to David that an even better outcome for the environment would be to use the excess solar generation stored in the battery to overnight charge electric replacements of his existing diesel-powered forklifts and delivery vehicles. This would directly reduce the carbon emissions rather than simply helping to tame peak electricity prices. Here is David with his 166 kilowatt-hour battery. And as an aside, David has had to deal with a social licence issue himself. Such issues can often derail a renewable energy project, as I mentioned earlier. His employees were apprehensive about sharing their workspace with this big box that they saw as potentially dangerous. By providing a large display adjacent to the battery, employees could see what was happening inside the box and confirm that everything was running as it should. This is a display which was developed for David by one of our Clean Energy for Eternity volunteers. And you can see it gives all the information that people need about the state of the battery, including its internal temperature. What David has done, every property owner could do, whether occupier or landlord. It would involve some sacrifice. It would require diverting time and money that could be spent on other things with more immediate personal benefit. The investment required in energy efficient measures and solar and battery, and a battery big enough to absorb the daytime solar, is not insignificant. Finance might need to be arranged. A measure of altruism would appear to be needed if we're going to tackle the climate crisis, especially if not wasting roof space and the social benefit was prioritised over minimising investment return. In other words, you fill the roof and you made sure you had a big enough battery. But not much altruism. The system will deliver savings every year, and at some point in its lifetime, it will become cash positive. Neither should the psychic benefit of doing the right thing be discounted, as David can testify. One thing for sure, he escapes the opprobrium of Thorstein Veblen, who in his book, The Theory of the Leisure Class, railed against what he called misdirected wealth. Imagine if all property owners followed David's example. The speed with which we could transform our energy system would be limited only by the capacity of the installation industry. But returning to altruism for a moment, this image is based on 2019 data, but it points to a shocking truth. Each row of people on the left represents an income decile. The contribution to global emissions of that decile is conveyed by the width of the champagne glass. People at the top 10% of incomes in the world contribute 50% of the global emissions. That's a bigger proportion than the 8% contributed by the poorest 50%. The super rich 0.1% contributed 4% of emissions, and their per capita carbon emissions were 300 times the poorest 50%. And I would hasten to say that I imagine most of the people on this Zoom are in the top 10% bracket. Property ownership, and hence roof space, tends to go with wealth, as does access to capital. It follows that those contributing the most of the problem are also the best place to address it. Perhaps it's not so much about altruism, but simply a matter of moral responsibility. Rich countries likewise have much higher per capita emissions than poor countries. In this map, the lighter the shading, the bigger the per capita emissions. It follows that rich countries should be coming up with a lion's share of the investment capital needed to fully decarbonise the planet. The moral imperative is all the greater, given that poor countries will be the ones most affected. This slide shows the likely impact on a region's GDP if global warming reaches 2 degrees by 2100. The lighter the shading, the bigger the impact. Those countries with the least capacity to handle climate-related humanitarian disasters will be those that have to deal with the floods, the droughts, and the excessive heat. Meanwhile, in well-off countries, there are those who have adopted a new form of climate denial around the idea that if you're wealthy enough, you can spend your way out of harm's way. The irony is that those countries most impacted and least responsible also have the greatest renewable energy resource. In this map, again, the lighter the colour, the greater the resource. Australia is an exception in being both rich and having an abundant solar resource. This is an opportunity to host energy-intensive industries and to export clean energy to the world in the form of ammonia and hydrogen, but also a responsibility to assist developing countries to develop their own resources. In attracting capital, developing countries can't compete with rich countries because of the perceived greater risk. At ClearSky, we know this firsthand. We have had opportunities to fund projects in Vanuatu and the People's Republic of Congo. In the end, we had to accept that those projects would never fly due to the risk premium. The high cost of capital in developing countries has another perverse effect. instead of exploiting renewable resource, they end up relying on building fossil fuel plants to keep up with energy demand. This is because the cost in fuel is then spread out over the facility's lifetime, whereas with renewables, with zero fuel cost, the full cost must be paid up front. There are moves afoot to de-risk renewable energy investment in developing countries. In a demonstrating project in the Maldives, the World Bank underwrote the risk of default and of currency exchange fluctuations and contract terminations, and this enabled a floating solar farm to be built instead of a new diesel-fired power station, resulting in fuel savings of over $20 million a year. Wealthy countries will need to contribute much more generously to the United Nations Green Climate Fund than their pledges to date, if equivalent underwriting is to be made available to all developing countries. The UN Green Climate Fund is one of two mechanisms set up by the United Nations to channel funding from rich countries that have caused the problem to poorer countries that will be most affected. The other is the Loss and Damage Fund. Australia has contributed a measly $5 million to the Green Climate Fund and $50 million to the Loss and Damage Fund, with another $150 million to help Pacific Island nations deal with sea level rise, which Australia is causing. I'd like to finish by coming back to why making the transition needs to be an urgent priority. When I earlier talked about the carbon budget remaining, if we wanted to stay below 1.5 degrees, I failed to mention an important proviso. Because it's very hard to model the sensitivity of temperature at 2100 to peak concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the best scientists can do is give a probability that the temperature will lie within a certain range. Oops. Even if we manage to stay within the IPCC carbon budget depicted in the slide, that doesn't guarantee heating will not exceed 1.5 degrees. The IPCC claim is simply that there's a 2/3 probability that 1.5 degrees won't be exceeded. And that means there's a 1/3 probability that it will, and a 10% chance that it will be exceeded by a considerable margin. Based on the current inadequate pledges, there is a 2/3 probability that the 2100 temperature will be within the range 2.5 to 4 degrees above pre-industrial average, and a 90% probability that it will lie in the range 2 to 5 degrees. A second proviso is that the date the IPCC reports have set out likely impacts in terms of increased heat waves, increased severe weather events, ocean acidification, etc., but not what would happen if a tipping point were to be triggered. When a tipping point is triggered, a positive feedback loop kicks in, causing rapid change until a new equilibrium is reached, an irreversible process resulting in very different climate conditions. In September last year, a highly significant paper was published in the journal Science by David Armstrong Mackay and others from the Stockholm Resilience Centre of Stockholm University. It's unfortunate that it didn't make it into the mainstream media, being overshadowed by the death of the Queen. Armstrong and his team have for the first time estimated the probability of various tipping points being triggered as a function of how much the Earth's temperature increased above pre-industrial levels by 2100. This slide summarizes the results. The bars represent probabilities of the tipping point being triggered at that temperature. Highly unlikely below the yellow end of the bar and highly likely above the red end. Current pledges expose us to a high probability that the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets will melt with constant sea level rise in the range 1 to 5 metres. Coral reefs and alpine glaciers are already at serious risk. If current pledges aren't met, further tipping points will be triggered with even more dire consequences. And there is an enormous disconnect between current pledges and the rate at which new fossil fuel projects are being approved and financed, the so-called production gap. The red line there is what emissions are likely to be in the world if all of the approved projects' capacity is exploited, and that is distinct from the blue line at the bottom of the graph, which is the emission trajectory that we need to stay within the 1.5 degree carbon budget. That's an enormous gap. And as the IEA has repeatedly said, there is no need for any more fossil fuel projects to be approved or developed. And of course, cartoonists have been quick to expose the implication of what we're doing. I've argued in this lecture that we have technology in place to solve the climate crisis. All we need to do now is to have the will and the money. A huge, enormous amount of money. It's needed for infrastructure, it's needed for resilience, it's needed for adaptation, it's needed to ensure an equitable transition. We're going to have to change our spending priorities as individuals and as nations. But I fear Walter Westman, the ecologist, would have considered this a grossly inadequate takeaway message. I believe he would have seen the climate crisis as just one of a bundle of threats that need to be addressed together, and that addressing them will require us to adopt a radically different and more enlightened way of living. Thank you. That, by the way, is the Imagine Solar Farm, the Clean Energy for Eternity, put to power the Tathra sewage treatment works, which you can see from the air flying in. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Warren, thank you for a very interesting, enlightening, and I would say sobering presentation. I want to, again, thank you for putting this all together. I want to, if people have questions, please put them in the chat. We would love to hear if you have any specific questions. A number of them come up for me. Right at the end, you talked about a number of other threats. So I'd be interested if you would maybe outline some of the other key threats that we need to deal with.
Yes, sure. There's actually a group in Australia, ironically founded by one of our former politicians, John Hewson. It's called the Council for a Human Future, or Council for the Human Future. And they've listed 9 threats which we need to be dealing with simultaneously. In fact, dealing with any one of them is likely to make the other ones worse. And they are global overheating, global poisoning, that's pollution, weapons of mass destruction, resource scarcity, food insecurity, ecological breakdown and extinction, pandemics, overpopulation, uncontrollable technologies, and mass delusion.
Not a small list.
Not a small list. And I mean, there is lots of people around the world working on alternatives. Julian Cribbs has just published a book recommending an Earth Systems Treaty to deal with some of these things. But as I say, there's such a big disconnect between a world which is spending all its money on fighting wars, when really the big crisis, the big challenge are these ones which I've listed.
Yeah, no, I agree. One other question, and then actually we'll let people turn on their videos and mics. But I was impressed with the return on investment that you were talking about at the beginning. If for people who are investing in this, in the installation of solar panels on buildings, and I was very impressed. Are there other places besides Australia that's trying to do this? It just seems like, here in the United States, it seems like something like this would be a great boon if you can get that kind of return on investment.
the return on investment depends upon having good sunshine and having high electricity prices. And in Australia, for various reasons, we have had very high, probably the world's highest electricity prices because of a complicated reason, but we invested an awful lot in our transmission network, and that cost got passed on to consumers. And so because of those high prices and because of the good sunshine, that's why we've got a very good return. So it mightn't be the same in other places, but it would still be significant.
Yeah. Okay. Well, people want to turn on their mics and certainly your videos. We'd be happy to have you do that. Anybody has a question out there, I could keep going. I have a long list, but I'd love to have other people who might want to ask a question of Warren. Roz. Oh, no, you just want to turn on your video. Okay, fair enough. Anybody else? Don't be shy. So then I'm going to go ahead with another question that I had. You'd commented about rooftop installations being, I think you called it I think you said a requirement. You know, I think about this, it relates to kind of, especially democracies, being able to deal with challenges like that or forced installations. Do you think we're ready to do that? So ready to have that happen?
Yeah, well, the problem, as many people have pointed out, is that wonderful as democracy is, it has some weaknesses. One of them is corporate capture by lobby groups and those with the most wealth. And the other one is the election cycle that which really focuses and causes politicians to focus on short-term wins rather than long-term issues. And it's interesting that if you compare the voices in civil society with the voices of politicians, you get very different statements. In fact, an Australian, Saul Griffith, who's the founder of a movement called Rewiring Australia, has pointed out, where is the leadership amongst politicians that was evidenced by Kennedy and the moon landing, for example? You just can't find it. The leadership in policy in climate is coming from non-state people, civil society. Antonio Guterres is, every utterance he makes, you can tell just how frustrated he is that no one's listening to what needs to happen. The Pope, in his what do they call them? Laudato Si encyclical, gave an 80-page dissertation about what needs to happen. So Greta Thunberg is waking us all up. But there's such is democracy that political leaders apparently feel that they can't lead. They require us to encourage them. They're not courageous. And for that reason, the more we can do and the more we can take things in our own hands, the better. But that's not excusing governments. Governments have to act. Humans can't do it alone. Ordinary people can't do it alone.
You're worrying about being reelected. Well, more sobering thoughts for sure. I see, Richard, you have your hand up. So.
Yep. Thanks very much, Dennis. Thank you, Warren. We live in a very enlightened country, a democratic country, where different ideas are brought forward to solve things. And recently, as you would know, we've had some attention given to nuclear power. I was wondering whether there's any evidence available, say, comparing France, which I think relies a lot on nuclear power, with a comparable country, possibly Germany, that doesn't, to give a bit of contrasting evidence to enlighten that sort of debate. Thank you.
I'm not aware of any particular evidence, but I can make some comments on the issue. I mean, France invested heavily in nuclear power in the 1950s, which Germany didn't. Clearly, nuclear power is part of the solution to providing clean energy for the globe. And it makes a lot of sense, if you already have it, to maintain it and develop it further. It doesn't make so much sense in Australia, but it would have made sense in Germany. Every country is a victim of their own history. And there was, as a result of, various political movements at the time, a move against nuclear in Germany. And they now probably regret that they didn't do as France did. This is not to say that nuclear energy has a big role. It certainly has a role in countries which don't have any natural resource of their own. Japan, I'm thinking of as well. But of course, the big debate is, how do you trade off the safety issue and the disposal of nuclear fuel issue against the clean energy? And that's what I was saying earlier about, you can't really solve any of these problems without addressing them all. And that's why it's so horrendously complex.
Thank you.
Any other questions out there? All right, well, I'm going to ask one more, and then maybe we'll say we've had enough. But the question for me that related to this relates to a lot of the new technology, the equipment. I think of all the data centers that are out there that we're growing, and they all require these rare elements that have to be mined. And so I think of the environmental trade-offs between having a lot of solar energy and things that the elements that are required there, and the environmental impact of the mining. And I wondered if you could address how do you balance those two? It's a bit like the nuclear energy question.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes, I think there are two opposing camps, I suppose. One is the no growth camp, and the other one is the green growth camp. So the green growth camp says, yes, provided we change our technology to clean energy, we can keep on growing forever. The no growth camp says, no, like the Club of Rome, that there has to be a limit to growth, and that the sooner we take into account that we can't keep on exhausting resources, in your case, rare earth minerals, to keep on producing ever more clean energy, the sooner we come to that realisation, the better. And of course, there's strong advocates, people who've written books about that. In Australia, Mark Diesendorf, who talks about a path to sustainable civilization, which is talking about the need to actually curb the ever-increasing demand for energy and actually start to wind it back, because you'll never get to a point where the energy component of GDP, or the energy component of GDP, is zero. Always increased GDP means more energy, and more energy is going to need more resources. And so that's an inconvenient truth, which we all need to take on board.
All right, well, Warren, thank you very much. And I'm going to, last opportunity for anybody that would like to ask Warren a question. I'll try and use my wait time. Well, again, let me thank you. A wonderful, enlightening, very thoughtful and sobering presentation. Appreciate that. I want to thank Roz and James for their help with putting this all together. And again, to Roger Westcomb for much of his initiation over the many years to make sure this happens. So thank you, everybody. We'll let you go and enjoy the rest of your Saturday. And I'm going to stop the recording, and hope you have a good weekend. Thanks a lot.